Now to our program, and a few notes first. Since the war broke out on October 6th, the Israeli-Palestinian crisis has been in the forefront of the news and also in the hearts of many in this room. Although the current crisis was a long time in the making, many don't have a good understanding of how the present day came to be. And as in many matters of history, there is more than one perspective and more than one story to be told. While we can't provide extensive information in the time allotted for a Rotary program, we have invited two prominent leaders in our community to deepen our understanding of the region's unique history, politics, economics, and more. Today, we will hear an Israeli perspective from Miryam Rosenzweig, President and CEO of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. Next week, we will hear Othman Atta, Executive Director of the Islamic Society of Milwaukee, who will approach the conversation from a Palestinian perspective. After Miryam speaks, our program committee chair, Jamie Reeve, will pose the questions to our speaker. We will not take live questions from the floor. Jamie is still collecting questions at the back of the room for a few more minutes. As I turn to the program, I want to acknowledge that these are challenging conversations, but that's what we do in Rotary. Some of us may hear things that are uncomfortable or things with which we don't agree. I personally intend to listen respectfully with the intention of learning something new, and I hope you share that intention as well. These civil conversations are an important part of our society. Now, please welcome Mitch Moser, Executive Director of the Jewish Community Foundation, to introduce our speaker. Mitch.
Thank you, Past President Jim. Around 6 years ago, I was a new Rotary member, proudly wearing my yellow striped name tag. George White of Quarles and Brady was completing his service here at Rotary, and in proper Rotary fashion, he wanted someone to carry the Quarles banner at Rotary in his place. I was honored to be a selection and was honored to become a Rotarian. At around the same time, I was appointed chair of the search committee to select a new president and CEO of the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. Their current CEO, Hannah Rosenthal, was retiring, and a lay search committee was assembled to find the new executive. Our committee's first two questions were whether there was anyone in the building who could ascend to this role, and whether there was anyone in the state of Wisconsin who would be appropriate for their position. Our next question was one that you may have faced in your organizations if asked to select a new CEO. If we were to perform a national search, would someone consider moving to Milwaukee to take this position when there were 6 other open Federation CEO positions across the U.S., most in warmer climates? I mean, we natives love Milwaukee, and we know what we have here, but our committee held a real concern about how successful we would be in our search. What we were able to find was a transformational leader who has made Milwaukee her home as nearly 5 years of Federation president and CEO. Miryam Rosenzweig was raised in Israel and attended Yeshiva University, where she obtained degrees of Bachelor's of Arts and Master's of Social Work. She lived in New York for 16 years, serving as head of development initiatives at World Ort and as associate director of the National Federation's National Young Leadership Training Program. She then moved to Detroit and excelled in the Next Gen space, creating and serving as the director of Next Gen Detroit, a groundbreaking initiative to promote outreach, engagement, and leadership that has been adopted by communities across the United States. She then rose to the positions of Senior Director of Community Development and then Chief Development Officer at the Detroit Jewish Federation. By the time she came before our search committee, she was the perfect combination of community builder, financial resource development professional, and young leadership Pied Piper. Since coming to Milwaukee, Miryam has been an exceptional leader both in the Jewish community and in working to improve our general Milwaukee community. We've thrown a ton at her. A global pandemic, a Ukraine war, a startling rise in local anti-Semitism, and now the October 7th attacks and aftermath. And Miryam continues to excel in community building and in leadership. Within 2 years of her arrival here, I was so taken by her strong and creative community leadership that when she asked me to leave my legal career of 30 years to become executive director of the Jewish Community Foundation, I could tell her no only twice. As she learned so well in her FRD training, she asked the third time. Miryam is in a perfect position to share with us an historical context to the current challenges in Israel and Gaza and how it impacts our Milwaukee community. She has lived in Israel and travels there frequently. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the Milwaukee Jewish Federation President and CEO, Miryam Rosenzweig.
I could tell he was a very smart leader for the search committee. So before I start, I just want to correct one thing that was said. I'm not here to represent the Israeli perspective. I'm here to represent the North American Jewish perspective. And though I am Israeli as well, I've lived in North America since 1987, and I represent the Jewish community. And so I just wanted to make that clarification for this conversation. You know, when I was asked to speak, and I'm asked to speak a lot right now about what's happening, I was told, great, how many hours do we have? And I was told we have 20 minutes. And to break down a extremely complicated, painful, emotional, traumatic experience for both Israelis, Palestinians, and Jewish people all over the world, there's no one who could do it justice in 20 minutes. So I'm going to try to pick a few themes, and I will stay afterwards for any questions, not just here, but if anybody wanted to speak to me about it. Before we start, I just want to make sure that we know what part of the world we're looking on. Oh, I have this. Oops. So just to have perspective, if you would look at the news, you would think that Israel is the largest country in the world. There was an AP story once that there were more reporters stationed on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I'm talking pre-October 7th, than something like China and a few other major countries combined. But really, we're talking about Israel, and within that, Palestine representing a very small part of a much broader region of both the Middle East and North Africa. And the other thing I need to establish before we start is the difference in when we're thinking about this, about the term Jew and Jewish and what it means. Because often people categorize Jewish only as a religion. It's how you practice a specific religion. And I need to make an emphasis that Judaism is much more than a religion. You can be Jewish and secular. You can be Jewish and an atheist. Jewish is a ethno-religious community that is rooted in a shared experience of having come from the same geography and having the same traditions. But being Jewish relates to much more than whether you decide that you want to keep kosher, whether you attend synagogue, whether you are agnostic. That doesn't matter. That is just how some Jewish people represent. In fact, only 10% of Jews in North America are considered Orthodox, which is the most traditional, and another 30+% belong to other denominations. The majority of Jews in North America consider themselves cultural or secular Jews. But we're rooted, and our traditions are rooted in a 2,000-year-old experience, and more than 2,000 years, a 3,000-year-old experience that begins in this part of the world. These are biblical times. On the left, you'll see the reign of the Israelite kings. You know that from the Bible. That's where you're hearing the word Israel from. And after that, there's a Babylonian takeover, which took over the Babylonians and Assyrians, and the kingdom of Judea is established. The kingdom of Judea represents only 20% of the people that were from the original Israeli tribes who were sent to the diaspora, and that's where the word Jewish comes from the word Judea. And it is at the end of the kingdom of Judea, a holiday you might know, the story of Hanukkah, where the Jews are exiled. And they're exiled and put into a diaspora. In fact, the first time that area of the world is called Palestine is coming from the Romans. The Romans want to stick it to the Jews at the time. They're sending them to all their different Roman places across the world. And in order to change the name and stick it then to the Jewish people, they change it to the name of the people who were there before, who were no longer there, the Philistines who had been gone early in biblical times, but in a way to erase the fact that Jews were there. But from this moment on, there's a continuous Jewish community living in this region at all time, but is now dispersed around the world. There are Jews in North Africa, there are Jews in Europe, and that's the majority of the concentration, because obviously that's where the Roman Empire was and existed. And you see the Jewish community really grow across Europe and North Africa. The last group to really have a hold on this part of the world is the Ottoman Empire. Now, just when you're talking about Israel and you talk old, there's a wall around Jerusalem called the New Wall, because it's only 400 years old, because it's the Ottoman Wall, right? That's the wall that the Turks put up there, and the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, is there until World War I. And this is a really pivotal moment that I'm going to come back to about what happens when the Ottoman Empire leaves and the British colony is taken into that region. The World War I is over, and the Europeans divide up the Ottoman Empire amongst themselves, right? Certain areas go to France, certain areas go to England, and the British take over a place that is called the British Mandate on Palestine, what is known today as Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. During the British Mandate on Palestine, they are making promises to both the Jewish community and the Arab community about forming states. And so I want to take a minute and talk about Zionism. Because I start off by saying that Jewish is much more than a religion. Our Jewish traditions are rooted around Israel. Has anyone here ever heard of Passover? Do you know what the last line of the Passover Seder is? Now, Passover is when we remember being kicked out of Egypt. The last line of the Passover Seder that ends the Passover Seder is next year in Jerusalem. Right? For 2,000 years, we ended our holiday where we talked about coming back as a Jewish community by ending with next year in Jerusalem. Our prayers are towards east, because the Jewish community was dispersed in the West, in Europe and in North Africa. And so we face east towards Jerusalem. Our prayers mention a return to Zion. Our prayers use the word Zion consistently throughout. That is not a new word. What happens in the late 1800s is that for the first time there's a new concept. The new concept of Zionism isn't a new concept about being able to return to the area. The new concept of Zionism is a secular return to Israel, a secular state that is not revolving around how you practice your Judaism. This is happening at a time when it has been now years where Jews have been kicked out of Spain and been kicked out of England and maybe kicked out of different places, and it is the height of anti-Semitism that was pre-World War I, the pogroms that were in Eastern Europe, and secular Jews are saying, why don't we go back and let's live there and have a place where we cannot be kicked out? And they existence of Jews, as I said, in that part of the world existed. It wasn't called Palestine at the time, it was the Ottoman Empire. And they start going there. My family, for example, I had a great aunt who walked from what is today Romania, but then was Hungary, and she would never admit that she was Romanian because those lines were important then, right? But she walked to Palestine and was one of the few to survive the Holocaust because she had gotten there before. The idea of Zionism was there's going to be one place in the world. There are Christian countries, there are Muslim countries, there are Hindu countries. There could be one place in the world where it's going to be safe to be Jewish. And in the early 1900s, that's what's happening. And there begins to be a growth of the Jewish community in Israel. And we need to know what British Mandate Palestine looked like. There was desert, the northern was swamps. There was a huge agricultural movement to drain the swamps. If you go to Israel, you'll see eucalyptus all around the north because they believe that that's what would drain the swamps. There becomes a dream, and the name of the dream is Cucumbers in the Desert, right? How do we grow food in a place that's inhospitable to food? And the notion that the Jews will be able to be self-sufficient. The Golda Meir joke, they went to the only country in the Middle East without natural resources, but they'll be self-sufficient, be protected, and won't be able to be kicked out. During that time, there's the Balfour Declaration in 1917, where the British government says there will be a Jewish state. There's the Peel Commission. And it's important to know that at the same time, the British Empire has asked the Arab League to help them defeat the Ottomans in World War I with making promises that they don't keep. And so the tension between the Jewish community and the Arab community that is living in that area begins to grow. They have a common enemy, which is the British, who are telling them different stories. And everything that I say now that I've said previously, I need to say that language is important, and I'm telling you a narrative of my people through the traumas of my experience. And if someone Palestinian was standing next to me right now, they may use different language and they may have different history. And there are facts, and there are facts that are experienced. And so I think it's really important that as I'm telling this story that we realize that there are moments that are extremely painful to the Jewish community, they're extremely painful to the Palestinian community, and we shouldn't lose the humanity of the other as I'm talking about these big world powers, because there were real people living there, and there was real motivations to make sure that these people didn't get along. I'm going to start with really what happens after World War II. After World War II, the United Nations comes together and says, okay, the British are going to leave this area, and we're going to divide it. And on the left, they come up with a partition plan. And what they decide is that what will be blue will be the Jewish state, and what is pink will be the Arab state. It's important to know that most of the blue from that center down is desert. There's some coastline, which was really important to the Jewish community because there was very little agriculture, and they were very vulnerable because the area in pink is the area that's actually on hills, right? So there's a geographic disadvantage. But they tried to represent the area where most people lived. The yellow was Jerusalem, and the yellow was designated as a international zone. The Jews in Israel at the time say yes. And now I think it's important to point out that the Arab League, these are the leaders of all the Arab nations come together and they reject the plan. And they say that if in May 1948, which was the deadline for Israel to declare itself a state, if Israel does it, on that day, they will be attacked by the entire Arab world. And I want to just point out who's around Israel. So to the south is Egypt, to the east is Jordan, to the north is Syria, above that is Lebanon. But if you remember that original slide, that means that Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Yemen are on that side, and Egypt and Libya and Sudan and all the way to Morocco are in North Africa. They accept it. Israel declares itself in May 1948. That next day, it is attacked by all the countries that is surrounded. There's the War of Independence. And during the War of Independence, the cry against the Jews is, we will drive them into the sea. And I mention this because words are important. And today you hear a chant, from the river to the sea. And those who remember that this has been a chant before know that it's a code word for we're going to wipe out the Jews from this land. And everyone thought that they would, including the Jews, right? This was a ragtag army of Holocaust survivors and those who came before, fighting against every nation around them. And they happened to have won. They were not assisted by other countries. That's not the only war they face. So by the end of the war, this is what Israel looks like. The blue becomes Israel. The pink, that kidney in the middle, that's what we call the West Bank. It's the West Bank of the Jordan River. That's that black line. That goes to Jordan. And the green on the far left is Gaza. And Gaza goes to Sinai. If you ask the Palestinian narrative at this point, this is known as the Nakba, the catastrophe, because their narrative is that 750,000 Palestinians were expelled into the West Bank or Gaza or other countries during that time. The Israeli narrative is that while some may have been forced out, the majority were encouraged to leave by the Arab League. And I don't know, I wasn't there. But I do know that that is the narrative, and it's a painful narrative that plays into where we are today. And it's really important to say that everybody who left, those 750,000 Palestinians who became refugees, are still considered refugees today. And that will also play into how we got to where we are today. Six-Day War, we have a similar situation. We have a big war with Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. But again, Israel wins, and they conquer the Sinai Desert, which is that bottom part. And you see at the top, the bottom blue, they capture the West Bank, which is important because for the first time, they're allowed to go back to Jerusalem. And they capture the Golan Heights in Syria, which gives them a strategic advantage in terms of being able to fight. There is another war in between peace with Egypt, which is the Yom Kippur War. And again, in each of these wars, the assumption is that Israel is going to be wiped out. And when they win the war in the Yom Kippur War, at this point, no Arab country recognizes Israel. Israel doesn't exist. It has been around for 20 years. It doesn't exist in the eyes of the Arab League, and Egypt is the first to stand up and say, if you give us back the Sinai Desert, we will have peace with you. And peace with Egypt is the big change. For the first time, there's an Arab nation who's a neighbor who becomes in peace with Israel and is in peace with Israel until today. Peace doesn't mean friends. Peace doesn't mean agree. Peace means we are not in active war. That means we are not in constant danger and that we can work in cooperation. I mentioned the Nakba because I think it's important for us to know that there's another part to this story. While 750,000 Palestinians left or were pushed out of what is Israel today, about 800,000 Jews were kicked out of every single Muslim country in the world. Countries that had hundreds of thousands of Jews were told, okay, you have a state, you may not take anything, and most of them made their way to Israel. And when we talk about Israel, people often talk about it only as European. A very cruel thing to say about Israelis is go back to Poland. Why is that so cruel? Well, first of all, 90% of Polish Jews were killed in the Holocaust. So go back to Poland is a pretty specific country to choose out of all the European countries. But they're negating that 60% of Israeli Jews, or approximately 60%, aren't European. They were Jews that were kicked out of Morocco and Algeria and Tunisia and Libya and Yemen and Iran and Iraq, right? And who have traditions that are not necessarily remotely European, even in how they practice their Judaism. You ever heard of gefilte fish? And if you haven't, it's okay, it's terrible. It's an Eastern European food that no Jewish person known as a Mizrahi, a Jewish person who comes from the Muslim countries would know. Whereas they came with hummus and falafel and Jewish food in Yemen called jachnun, which I never heard of in my Ashkenazi upbringing. So you have two places where there's mass immigration in a very short time. But I want to say that the children of those who came as immigrants and refugees who landed in Israel were given citizenship, and their children are citizens and they're living regular lives, whereas the children and grandchildren of Palestinian refugees were never given citizens of the countries that they're in, and they are still refugees in Gaza, they are still refugees in the West Bank, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Egypt. And these camps, these refugee camps, are still run by the UN. The UN has a refugee organization for the whole world's refugee, and only one specifically, UNRWA, for the Palestinian refugees. And you can't deny that not allowing people to become a citizen, right, contributes to the situation that Palestinians are in today. There have been attempts at peace. Obviously, as I mentioned, the partition plan was rejected. There was the Camp David summit that was rejected. That was the Oslo Accords. And I didn't put that as rejected because there were actually good things that happened from the Oslo Accords. And then in 2005, something big happened. In 2005, the Israeli government made a decision, which was, we are taking all Jews out of Gaza. We are going to give Gaza back to the Palestinian Authority that was established during the Oslo Accords, and they're going to run Gaza. And in 2005, they removed every single Israeli from Gaza and handed it over to the Palestinian Authority. The challenge was that a year later, they held their first elections, and in their first elections, they elected Hamas. And Hamas won the elections, killed their Palestinian Authority minority parties. They literally threw them off the roof, and they've been controlling Gaza ever since. There's never been elections since that time. And since then, Israel and Egypt have closed off the border. And when you hear about the siege on Gaza or the closing off of the borders, first of all, it's Israel and Egypt. It's not just Israel. And it doesn't happen until after Hamas comes to power. The idea originally was that Gaza would become its own independent state and be able to become what they said at the time, the Singapore of the Middle East. Okay, I have 3 minutes. I think it's important for us to know who Hamas is in order to understand the current conflict, which is, first of all, what their goal is. And Hamas is, says in its preamble, Israel will exist and continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, not Palestinians, right? Not secular people. It is a religious movement, and it mentions Islam specifically. The call to jihad, right, which is a violent call, and it calls for the world, right? Masses everywhere in the Islamic world will come forward in response to the call of duty. Many of us believe that they thought that that's what was going to happen on October 7th, that the Islamic world would join what was happening. They rejected any peace process, and everything that's here is from the Hamas charter, and I invite you not to believe me, but to Google the Hamas charter. But they actually reject any peace process. They say specifically peace initiatives are in contradictions to the principles of Islamic resistance movement. There is no solution for the Palestinian problem except by jihad. So when people say, why is there no peace or discussion of peace? It's hard to have peace with someone, with an organization. And these are not the Palestinian people. This is Hamas that's saying there will be no peace. And in fact, they condemn Egypt for having made peace with Israel. Now, I'm often told that anytime someone criticizes Israel, they're called anti-Semitic. And I will challenge that and say, there are many people who have legitimate criticism of Israel, even criticism that I completely disagree with and I believe is false. Criticism of Israel is not limited, by the way, to non-Jews, because if you want to see criticism of Israel, for the 9 months before October 7th, for every single Saturday night, there was a massive 100 to 200,000 person march in Tel Aviv against the current government of Israel, because they believed that they were too extreme. It stopped on October 7th because the war started. So criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. There's 3 criteria that we look for when it's anti-Semitic. The first one is delegitimization. Israel is the only country in the world we've ever heard of that is not allowed to exist, right? Whether you believe the worst of Israel, that it's the colonial whatever, we're in America. I don't know that anybody would say that most people in America are native and indigenous, but no one says America doesn't have the right to exist. Israel is the only country that question is on the agenda. The second one is dehumanizing, creating tropes. Israel controls the money. Israel is trying to silence you. Israelis are powerful, and Israelis are trying to, whenever you get into those tropes, rather than how you would discuss any other government, even governments that you can't stand. And the other one is the double standard, right? When Israel is expected to do something that no other country in the world is expected to do. If you want to know what double standard looks like, in 2023, the UN had 14 resolutions against Israel. It had 7 resolutions against the rest of the world combined. Now, again, you could agree with all 14 of the resolutions, but if you're going to tell me that North Korea and China and Russia and all those countries, and all the Islamic countries that are dictatorships and monarchies are so much better that Israel in itself is, it could have 14 different sanctions against it, that's when I would call it anti-Semitic. So just to make sure that we understand the anti-Semitic roots of Hamas, I want to point out that in their Article 7, it says, the day of judgment will come about until Muslims will fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, "Oh Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me, come and kill it." And one that I thought really stood out for me, at the bottom it says, with their money, they formed secret organizations such as the Freemasons, Rotary clubs, and the Lions. So just so that you know, you're part of the Zionist agenda, according to this document. Their scheme has been laid out in the Protocols of Elders of Zion. That was the anti-Semitic work that was promoted by the Nazis. And so again, if we were really talking about Zionism being not about being Jewish, if it was about Palestinians being able to live in Israel and coming back, we would be talking about policy. We wouldn't be talking about Zionism, right? This is not a conversation that has revolved around policy. It has revolved around religion and who has a right to be there. I'm going to quickly, I want to just show that this image you will see very often. And I want to just point out why it's propaganda. If you see the first map, in 1947, it says Jewish settlements in Palestinian land. This is showing what it was like under the British Mandate. It makes the assumption that that was under Palestinian leadership. There was no Palestinian leadership. It was under the British. And again, before the British, it was the Ottoman. And before that, it was other areas. There was nothing there. There was no people there. I mean, there was no leadership of the Palestinian people there. If you look at the UN partition plan, that was exactly what they had pointed out. If you look at 1967, it wasn't just out of nowhere it came out. That's after the 6-Day War. That is conquered land after war. And if you look at the current day, it leaves out the part of that is the West Bank, and it's just highlighting it. So it's when propaganda could be rooted in truth. It's true that there were Palestinian places there, but it's making assumptions it's making statements on the ignorance of most people on the history that was over there. I'm just going to end with a quick explanations of some of the big statements that have been made. The first is that Israel's an apartheid state. Currently, there is in Israel 2 million, not Palestinians, 2 million Israeli Arab Palestinians. These are full citizens of Israel. One of them sits on the Supreme Court and put a past prime minister in jail. Tell me an apartheid state where the minority sits on the Supreme Court and is able to do that, right? They're able to vote, in the last government, pre-Netanyahu, the Arab coalition was part of the majority, right? That is not an apartheid state. We can talk about occupation and the challenges and the difficulty that it puts and the arguments in Israel. And if you were in Israel during those marches, there's people who are in Israel who are talking about the occupation. But apartheid state, go look in Israel and find me a country surrounding Israel where people have the kind of equal rights, including the minorities. The colonial imperialists, Israel didn't come from a majority country that came and invaded. That's just a nonsense conversation. And the last is genocide, that they were committing genocide. Now, this is not an allegation that's come on since October 7th. This is a constant allegation. And first of all, genocide implies that you're trying to erase the people that you're killing, that you're trying to get them to be less. And if you look at the Palestinian population in Gaza and the West Bank, it has only grown since 1948, which is not how genocide works, right? That's not what has been happening. It has grown to now, I believe, somewhere in the close to 6 million. So the solutions that have to come and the notion that there are two people who have suffered here is not by saying one is bad and one isn't. The American Jewish community overwhelmingly believes in a two-state solution, overwhelmingly believes that we need to live in peace with our neighbors, overwhelmingly believes in the humanity of the Palestinian people, and there are extremists. The difference is that there's marches against them and stopping them, and they're not voted in to determine how we're doing all future work. So that's as quickly as I can go. I will invite you for questions, and I thank you for your time. And again, I think the subject could be studied over centuries, but I hope it was helpful.
Miryam, thank you. That reminds me of a couple of assignments I had in college that were impossible. In all seriousness, this is a topic that's extremely timely and very difficult for many of us. And thank you for giving us a very quick history lesson. Some questions that were garnered ahead of time aren't appropriate given what we learned today. So let's focus on something you just mentioned in your closing statements. Is a two-state solution possible?
Of course, a two-state solution is possible. It will require, before October 7th, it was already hard. It will require a lot of faith. I don't think it's a coincidence. Some of the towns that were attacked on October 7th were the most progressive towns in Israel. The founding of the Peace Now movement was in Be'eri. And we know that Be'eri, which was a place where there was massive devastation, was targeted. It wasn't by accident that they got there. And what I'm about to say is my opinion, but I am not surprised that they would go to a place where are the most peaceful activists who have been fighting and fighting for a two-state solution because they lived on the border. These are people who would help Palestinians in Gaza go to the hospitals in Israel, who were employing Gazans. And there was a major trust that was broken on October 7th. And I think that plays into extremists on all sides when trust is broken, right? Because it reinforces you can't trust them. So in order for two-state solution to happen, we will need our governments to enforce it, for our elected officials to make sure that they are not just talking about it, but creating a situation for prosperity for all. Making sure that the Palestinian people in Gaza, where their government isn't stealing their money and hoarding all of their supplies, but actually helping them flourish. Where they're not billionaires sitting in Qatar, but instead they're able to actually help their people who are there because of suffering people have no incentive for peace. And I think on the Israeli side, as the American Jewish community, we're really focused on making sure that we are working on specifically mental health because we're concerned about the trauma solidifying a narrative that would be like, well, it's impossible. And impossible is not an option. The Israeli national anthem is called Hatikva, which means the hope. And in order, I think the saying is, in order to be a realist, if you're Jewish, you have to believe in miracles, right? So I think the same thing is true for Israel. If we don't believe that we can achieve peace, then there is no hope for everybody.
Thank you. Circling back to some of your opening comments, I'm paraphrasing, you said something to the effect of there are real motivations to ensure these people, these cultures, don't get along. Tell us more explicitly what that means.
Well, I showed you a map of the area, and the decisions that were made for the Palestinian people by the Arab League, you have to wonder why. And every time you see something flare up between Israelis and Palestinians, you see a united Arab community. And so while there are problems going on in all of the dictatorships and monarchies that are surrounding that area, when their people are really suffering from the leadership that they're living under, they're able to unite them under one thing, which is look what the Israelis, look what the Jews are doing to Palestinians. And so then you're not focused on the fact that the Sudanese are murdering Muslims right now, or that 1 million Afghans are being kicked out of Pakistan, or all the other issues in the economy that are happening in those surrounding countries, because you have one thing to focus on. You know, everything would be okay if just those Jews wouldn't do what they're doing. And so that there's a lot of interest in that. And I think we can't take away the part of what was happening during World War I and World War II, where Europe had taken over mass, colonizing a lot of land, and now is sort of stepping away and saying, hey, this is not our problem. You're there, it's your problem. And so flaring that up has a lot of advantage for governments. What it ends up happening is that people are suffering, and people on all sides.
This is adjacent to that question. You also talk about the difference between anti-Semitism and being critical of Israel. Many people condemn the actions of the Israeli government, but do not blame the Jewish community as a whole. What do you say to these people?
First of all, I hope it's many, but that's not been the experience. So October 7th happened, the biggest, the most devastating day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, and anti-Semitism shot up globally. So the two being separated is different. What I would say is this: you could be critical of Israel, you could completely disagree, with what they're doing. Those who are calling for a ceasefire because they really believe that that will stop not only the fighting in Gaza and not only the loss of human life in Gaza, but will ensure that there won't be continued loss of life in Israel, then I disagree, but that's not anti-Semitic. That's just, we disagree. I think when it goes over into the other side, when it goes further than that, and we have calls for like resistance at any, by any means, or call for intifada, which we know, I lived through the first intifada, and I remember being scared to get blown up every day. And I happened to have been in Israel in the second intifada. That's not what we're talking about. But again, criticism of Israel and every single one of its policies is not anti-Semitic. As long as you would apply that same criticism to any other country in the world if they were doing it. If it's uniquely Israel, that's when it looks at it. If you look at the amount of coverage around Israel, it's just baffling. It's not baffling to me in terms of like, I want to know what's happening. I have two sisters who live there. But it is important for us to recognize those differences.
For a country that relies so heavily on tourism, how does Israel eventually get back to the ability to host travelers to the Holy Land?
Well, I think that Israel doesn't only rely on tourism. Israel has been called the startup nation because in a country that didn't have natural resources, they found resources, and that was brain power. And if you've ever read the book Startup Nation, it sort of takes how the attitude of Israelis, it's not about being smarter, it's about the fact that they've had to live through the last 75 years and in how they behave that has let them into incredible innovation. And so there's no question that the economy has taken a big hit, that tourism is down and will be down. But I believe, and I believe that the strength of Israel is beyond this moment in time. The unity in Israel, not just within Jewish Israel, but the Arab community in Israel coming together, especially the Bedouin community, which historically has been always very private and very separate, have come out, and you have people coming out and saying, "I'm Israeli." Right? It's a moment of pride because they don't want to be taken over by Hamas. Again, I'm talking about Israeli Arabs. A Palestinian living in the West Bank may not be saying that because their experience is different.
You reference your sisters. What we know, the little that we know, we're consuming through our media channels. What's happening behind the scenes in Israel that we aren't seeing?
Okay, how many hours? What's happening behind the scenes? So for the last 20 years, or the last 16 years since Hamas has taken over, Hamas has been shooting rockets into Israel. And the law in Israel now is that any home that is built, any new construction, has to have a safe room in the apartment or in the house. Now we have learned since October 7th that those safe rooms were built to protect from rockets, not from people breaking in. But the intention was we got to keep people safe. In the same time, they developed the Iron Dome. And the Iron Dome is very famous. And it's the only thing that you've ever heard from weaponry that is unable to be offensive. It could only be defensive. The only thing it could do is if a rocket is coming in, it could predict where it's going to go. And if it's not going to hit a urban area, it's going to try to shoot it. And it only works on rockets and not on missiles. And since October 7th, I've become an expert. Missiles can move once they've been shot, rockets can't, right? So Israel's invested a lot in the defensive part of that. So what's changed in Israel is that regardless of where you live, for the last 90 days, you've basically been under rocket attack all day long. One of my sisters live in central Israel. Her 2-year-old daughter hears the red alert, and she knows. We walk into the safe room, we close the door, and we wait until it's the all clear. And I said to my sister, how's it like? She's 2 years old. And she said she's living her best life right now. What she knows is we go in there, I get a snack, and I get to watch my iPad. And my sister's calm enough, but they don't live in the South where it's happening all day, every day. The other thing that's happened is that my sister said there's no men in her office, right? In the first month of the war, everybody went to fight because the feeling in Israel was, the phrase in Israel is that, and the Yom Kippur War was, the Syrians are on defense. It was like they're coming in and it's over. That's how existential it felt. And so on October 7th, the 300,000 people who were called up were in all areas of business. And so it's impacted it. It has brought the country together after 9 months of real division over this current government. And if you follow Israeli news now, that underlayer is coming. Having said that, everybody knows someone who's been a hostage or who's still a hostage, who's been killed. It's a small country. Everyone, and it's not just the Jewish community, it has affected the Muslim, Christian, and Druze community as well, who were affected on October 7th.
Maybe the final question, you just referenced everyone knowing a hostage. Of course, that's some of the headlines that we're all seeing. What is the current status of those hostages taken October 6th? And specifically, that's a tactic. What is the approach? What is the methodology in terms of it's a very unique tactic, and it takes certain things off the table, correct?
Yeah. So, first of all, nobody called me to ask my opinion on how we should free the hostages. So this is, based on what I'm reading. As of today, there's still 136 hostages in Gaza. We know that there's still 2 children, one that just turned a year old, one that's 4 years old. We know that there's still women, young women that are still there. And we know that hostages have come out and said that they know that both men and women who are still there have been sexually assaulted while they're hostages, and that some of them are not going to be let out because they don't want people to know what's been done to them. I think we don't know. Israel has a different approach to hostages than the United States. America doesn't negotiate with terrorists. Israel does. In the last big negotiation, there was until now it hasn't been civilians. That's the big difference, and these quantities. But Gilad Shalit was a soldier who was kidnapped, and he was held hostage for, I believe, 5 years. And in return for Gilad Shalit, Netanyahu gave 1,000 political prisoners. One of the political prisoners that were released was Yahya Sinwar, who was the mastermind and leader of Hamas behind October 7th. So there's a lot of mixed feelings, because even in the last round of hostages released, everybody wants them released. And the price was lower. It was 1 Israeli for 3 political prisoners. But everybody knows that you don't know who you're releasing, and what that means. What we know from the hostages that have returned is that some were in tunnels. I was somebody who just assumed they were all in the tunnel structure underground. Some were in people's apartments, and their children came in and looked at them and walked around, and the wife was angry because the husband was watching over a young girl, and they were in people's apartments. And so I don't know. I think the devastation that we're seeing right now is because how do you fight an urban war when the enemy is intentionally hiding within civilian populations so that the story will be about civilian casualties rather than about them? They just found yesterday the largest munition factory, which is on the line that we call the humanitarian line, where people are supposed to pass by. So it is designed in order to make sure that there'll be maximum civilian casualties. There have already been Israeli civilian casualties. We know that 3 hostages were killed when they came out and they were misidentified as terrorists. And so there's a lot of conversation happening in Israel. And they're coming back together, and I don't know how to solve it. I know that this war could have ended on October 7th. There was one condition: have the Hamas leadership surrender and stop shelling Israel, return the hostages. That's it. We haven't gotten the hostages. They're still shelling Israel every day. And obviously, the Hamas leadership is not giving itself up. It is deep in the tunnels, hiding.
Thank you again for sharing your time, your insights, your personal experiences with us today.
Thank you.